Welcome to the Spirit of Truth video podcast. Joining us today is my good friend Angie Thurston. Hey, Angie.
Hey, Derek.
All right. Well, stick around as we get to know Angie a lot better. Welcome back. So, like I said, joining me is my really good friend, second generation reader, graduate of Harvard Divinity School, Miss Angie Thurston. Welcome, Angie.
Thank you, Derek. Good to be here.
All right. Well, this is something that I've been trying to do for a long time. We know the situation, but congratulations for all your accolades. You do a lot of work out there. You are the epitome of this show of actualizing the revelation into the real world. So kudos to you. I and many others are super proud of you. So thank you so much for all the work that you do.
Thank you, Derek. Well, I feel much the same way about you. I'm so excited for this project and honored to be a part of it.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, you've been out there sharing. I mean, maybe we could get people up to speed a little bit of, you know, you're a second generation reader, graduate of Harvard Divinity School, and you apply teachings in the Urantia Book and teachings of Jesus into a professional sector, essentially, right?
Right.
So maybe you could just kind of get us up to speed of what got you there.
Sure. Well, let's see. It certainly dates back to my upbringing. And as you've said, I did grow up with the Urantia Book, and some who are watching will be familiar with my father, Chuck Thurston, because he has done quite a number of these with you at this point.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And my mom, Claire Thurston, both of them were students of the Urantia Book before I was born. So I did have the good fortune of having access to these teachings right from the beginning. And, you know, I think what's noteworthy about that is that both of my parents were really hungry for truth, as I think is the case with many people who go on to find the Urantia Book, right? They spend years and years feeling really hungry and looking everywhere they can find. So it's a different situation as a second generation reader. And Derek, you might be able to attest to this in your own way. It's like, you know, I had access to the Urantia Book, but then I kind of had to figure out what my own perspective was about this text that was claiming to be revelatory and that was providing a foundation for my parents' spiritual life and for our home and family life. So I ended up, I think, really encountering those questions in a big way when I was in my 20s. I had grown up in a culture there, mostly in Boulder, Colorado, for the years between age 8 and 18, where there were a number of other young Urantia Book readers as well, and a number of families. So I did have a kind of culture of readership, even though, of course, it was only a small group of us. But then college was really a time when all of that fell away, right? And so I was kind of left as an ambassador of this text that I still didn't really understand. And so I honestly, I kind of shelved it. And it wasn't until I was after college living in New York City and myself encountering my own hunger for spiritual depth and spiritual community that I re-engaged it as an adult and really asked myself, you know, what is this? And do I believe that it is what it claims to be? And that became a catalyst for the journey I've been on ever since. And I think one of the first things that I went looking for was some way to socialize my spiritual life. You know, I recognized that it was all about my personal relationship with God. And I was finally starting to really cultivate that relationship actively, as opposed to just sort of taking it for granted, but not doing anything about it.
Right.
And so I was little by little beginning to take that seriously and beginning to get to know God. But I was just so eager to have other people to do that with and to explore that with. And and it was in two directions. I think I wanted other people who were peers who had the Urantia book as a reference point. And then I also wanted to be able to explore spiritual matters with people who didn't identify with the Urantia book or even know about it necessarily. And so those two things, I think one of them led me to get more and more involved in the Urantia community itself and gathering young Urantia book readers and other efforts like that. And then the other led me down a professional path that took me to Harvard Divinity School and asking the question, how might I be of service in helping to deepen spiritual community at a time I learned where there was so much religious change, that my particular yearning to socialize my spiritual life, and yet the fact that I didn't fit inside of an organized religion, was actually a common phenomenon and a growing phenomenon among millennials and among the generation coming after us. So that whole set of questions really became, they were deeply personal questions, of course, but they became a professional inquiry that I went and pursued in school and then ended up creating a job out of.
That's so awesome. That's so cool. I can relate, and I commend you for searching to finding your deepest truth and then aligning around that and living it even into the professional world and how it just spills out into that. And there's so many questions that I have from your introduction. Thank you so much for that. But I guess let's just first start off on being a second generation reader and kind of, like you said, valuing the credibility perhaps through the parents that you value, knowing that they were influenced and inspired by this text, but not having the life that allows to, or that you felt allowed to really go into this, or that you needed that value from that book, so you shelved it for a while. I did the same thing when I went to college. I hadn't opened the Urantia book, but I had it in my house. I literally packed it when I went away to college because I could like feel the value in the thing.
Yeah, me too. I
never opened it. I never opened it all of college. You still got it?
Yeah. Well, I put it on an actual shelf. It was like in my, yeah.
So I could totally relate to that. It's like where you're like, okay, something's valuable here, but life is life. And I think as your purposes evolve spiritually, to where then you can start to discern values that reflect that purpose and things like that. So, but then you integrated it fully into a master's school, right? At Harvard Divinity.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little about some of the details in that, if you can, about like, that was your major, Urantia book was your interest in your study, or how did that break down?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. So I think what felt very important to me was that if I was going to go invest in a graduate degree program, which was 3 years long and very expensive and required me to upend my life, I didn't want to do that and be closeted about the Urantia book. It felt very important that I be able to be fully out in the open about this being the primary spiritual text in my life, the foundation of my worldview, my framework for reality. And so I basically, it was a challenge I made to myself that in my application, I was very overt about it. And in all of my coursework, I was very overt about it. I used it as a reference text in my papers. Cool. I created a Urantia book study group on campus. I wrote a musical because my background had been in playwriting. And so I wrote a musical about the story of Ruth, Jesus's baby sister, and their relationship, which I ended up doing a performance of with a whole bunch of other divinity school students on campus.
Wow.
I did we had these weekly worship services on campus, and I did a few of them sponsored by the Urantia Book Study Group, student group, where we had Pato Banton and Antoinette Hall come and lead a worship. We had Christina Seaborn come and lead a worship. So I really, it was really a challenge to myself, to my own courage and creativity, to say, it's so rare to get an opportunity like this, right? To be in one of the centers of learning in the world, right? At this sort of very prestigious institution, and to have access to this supernal text, the Urantia Book, right? So I just really felt, in a funny way, I felt like it was my responsibility to do everything I could and not worry about my own reputation or how it might be perceived, to just get it out there, and to get it out there in a positive way, and in a way that, helped to share the teachings and the fruits of what's in here. So that was what I did, kind of as a student and as somebody participating in that graduate community. Mm-hmm. But when it came to my actual studies, I was really interested in the phenomenon of religious disaffiliation, and the fact that millennials and Gen Z were less and less affiliated with organized religion. So the kind of, when offered categories for what is your religion, that more and more of us were saying none of the above, or nothing in particular, or spiritual but not religious, right?
Right.
By the time I enrolled in grad school in 2013, it was about a third of the millennial generation who were identifying this way. And I was really curious, because I knew from myself, as someone who was religiously unaffiliated, that had nothing to do with me being secular in the sense of, antagonistic to religion and or atheistic, right? That in fact, I had a very rich spiritual life and I considered myself quite religious, right? It just didn't fit into any of those boxes. So I was really curious about other people in this demographic and what they were like, and if that applied to them, or, were these people all atheist and agnostic and that's what it came down to, or was there more going on? And so I was really influenced by the teachings of the Urantia Book in asking those questions, because so much of the teachings center on the idea of a personal relationship with God, the idea of personal religion, and the idea of seeking truth wherever you can find it, right? There's so much in this text that is doing work to draw out truths that have come down to us from all these different wisdom streams, right? So I was like, it seems to me that a lot of these young folks who are in my generation are actually having kind of a reality response, that they're saying, it seems like truth can't be contained in these boxes we've created, that actually it's more dynamic than that. And what I'm drawing on in my own spiritual inquiry is has too much multiplicity in it to be categorized given the options that are presented. And that turned out to be largely the case. And so a lot of what I worked on as a student and what I still work on in my professional life has to do with trying to foster community for spiritual deepening among people who don't necessarily share a religious identity or a kind of coherent set of practices or beliefs, right? That they might be drawing from many different places, but they're still deeply interested in living a life of meaning and purposefulness and personal growth and contributing to social change and all the rest of it. So the Urantia Book really gave me a foundation to pursue that without any fear, because I was convinced of the fact that people who were part of this phenomenon were onto something. And I knew that they could often end up very isolated in that pursuit. And that I knew would be dangerous, right? Isolation is always dangerous, but spiritual isolation is particularly so. And so I was really, I was and remain very convicted by the desire to help bring people together on their spiritual journeys.
That's so cool. I appreciate you explaining that to us in the academic sense too, because there's not a lot of people who can apply revelation teachings and cite it in their academic work and then apply that into their professional field. And I commend you for staying loyal to, your spiritual passion and loyal to your calling. And I wonder, are there any do you find yourself having to compromise with anything along the way, as far as maybe your language or maybe beliefs or different ways that you have to articulate some of these truths that you're trying to share?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, it feels so connected to my own spiritual maturation, which is very much a work in progress. There were just so many moments, first of all, when I was in grad school, that I just kept wishing that I had Jesus's skillfulness, where he would like encounter whatever the prevailing perspectives were in the context he was in and in his day. And then he would have this, perfect ability to never take anything away, but to give further truth. Right. So that I certainly tried to do it, but there were so many times where I would just sort of shake my head like, this is such a disaster. I remember once I took a class on Pentecostalism, and we were talking about, just the interpretations of what happened on Pentecost, and how there were all of, the whole notion of speaking in tongues that is now a part of many Pentecostal communities, and how this was connected to what happened that day. And, this example was true again and again and again, but it's like, here I have this explanation of Pentecost in the Urantia book that makes a lot of sense to me.
Right.
Okay? And usually the way that they explain things in the Urantia book makes a lot of sense to me, right? They're kind of unromantic about the way that they depict what goes on. So they're kind of like, yeah, there were all these people who were there from all different places because it was a holiday, and, then the Spirit of Truth comes, and, the kind of explanation of like, yeah, people were speaking a whole bunch of different languages. And also there was, a deep feeling of spiritual presence that pervaded the place. Right. But how single lines like that in scripture have been interpreted, and entire religious movements have been created out of them. And so I just remember being kind of flummoxed of like, I have access to this particular account, which feels pretty authoritative to me, but no one else recognizes the authority of this text. They've never even heard of it. And, for me to assert the possibility that maybe there were just people speaking a whole bunch of different languages, it doesn't necessarily feel fruitful, or I couldn't find a way to make. So I'm just giving that as an example of what was kind of a regular occurrence, where I would come up against what is commonly known or has been thought about, both by theologians and also by practitioners. And it was really juicy because I would get to then re-encounter the Urantia book and be like, well, what does the Urantia book say about this? I've never thought about it through this lens. But often when you ask about compromise, often it was just a feeling of like, I wish I could do more to be useful and contributory, but I don't know how. So that was a regular kind of conundrum. And it's one that I don't know about you, Derek. I mean, just kind of in everyday life, having the Urantia book as a reference point is a great opportunity to practice, right? Trying to offer insight that might be useful to the people that you cross paths with. Because sometimes I have insight that's born of my own personal experience, but then other times there's insight that I have access to because of the Urantia book, not that I kind of earned, right? That's the whole notion. Right. Revelation is like, I didn't earn this insight, but I do believe it now. And so maybe I could share it.
Yeah, exactly. Share it. And that's kind of like what we live by around here is, freely have you been given, freely will you share.
That's right. That's right.
But I admire you going through those challenges. I know what it's like when, you're face to face with some place where you can spread seeds and maybe take the conversation to a higher level, like the Urantia book presents it. But at the same time, being so human and having to deal with all these emotions and friendships and just all sorts of things that come with personality, you really see how this is a training sphere, and you got a lot of really good practice, I feel like. So while I can sometimes feel like, oh man, I'm failing, it's also this is experience that I'm sure you draw from now in present day. And you maybe you'd probably like to go back in time and be like, oh man, now that I know all this stuff, I wish I could go back and share some wisdom with some people. But
yeah, it's all learning and growth for sure. But yeah, I think there is, and honestly, this is very present with me all the way up to right now, this sense of, I really admire how Jesus was able to translate his teachings into the vernacular of the people in his presence, right? How, and that was born of his having actually pursued experience and been curious about both people and what they did, right? So he could speak the language of carpentry with carpenters and the language of fishing with fishermen, right? And he could speak, in the temple and speak to the Pharisees and Sadducees, right? So he was just so multilingual in his approach to ministry. And I really admire that. So on the one hand, I think as I've worked so much in secular environments, I've tried to find words and language that is able to be heard, because so much of the language of religion and the language of God has become associated in the minds of a lot of people who self-identify as secular, with things that are damaging and harmful and oppressive and all of this, right? So there's a lot of language that I use to talk about the soul and to talk about spirit and to talk about community that is, kind of in a secular vernacular, even though it's pointing to, what is sort of what matters most for each of us. And this idea of there being something more than what we see.
I hear you talk about that a lot. I've heard a few of your interviews where you're safe saying, you feel safe, I'm assuming, of saying something more, right? Something greater, or maybe something going within. Right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. But I'm kind of I feel like I'm on a threshold a little bit where,
what do you mean?
Just in the sense that I think there is a limit to the effectiveness of a kind of constant translation effort. And that's something that I don't yet have full clarity on, but my sense is that as I go forward in the next chapter of my work, that it's going to be important to kind of harness some of that same courage that brought me to divinity school in the first place and say, the reason that I've gone in this direction and followed this path is to try to serve people as fully and deeply as possible. And so that might entail me articulating things a little bit more overtly, even if it risks kind of losing people. Because I think for those who are really hungry, kind of giving pieces of the truth is not going to quench that hunger.
Yeah, you're throwing them crumbs, scraps from the table.
Yeah. So honestly, just in part because of my own journey, but in part because of the world as it is and the suffering that is so rampant. It's like there's no point in holding back.
Amen, sister. And I also say, part of this no holding back is that with Jesus's teachings, it was the simple people who heard him gladly. And I think that, I'm a product of Western education, higher education. You definitely are in the higher levels of academia. And I'm just juggling this around in my head. You can agree with it, not whatever, but in this Western society, we have so many materialistic distractions or concerns or whatever it is that we have a tendency to maybe get away from the stuff that really matters when our life is on the line and it's very simple, whether we reach out to God or we don't. It's like, and so what I'm finding from my friends in like Africa and the Middle East is that they take on the truth very quickly because they are simple. They are not bombarded with these distractions of narcissism and material indulgence and other things that us in the West have to battle with internally, like constantly almost. So I don't know in the higher levels of academia, if then you're having to walk a tightrope of, okay, I don't want to offend anyone here. I don't want my friends to get ridiculed there. Like, but I want to stay loyal to the truth. And now you're just kind of like, man, forget it. I'm just going to tell it all, because whoever will hear, whoever has ears to hear will hear, and they will be transformed or something like that. Is that kind of...
Well, I think that there are ways in which most of us are simple.
Mm-hmm.
Like we are, I have been interested to see that, for instance, one of the most popular courses at Harvard University for undergrads is a course on Confucianism and the good life, which is essentially about, a philosophy of living. And one of the most popular courses at Yale is something about positivity. It's like positive psychology. And one of the most popular ones at Stanford is, touchy-feely. That's in the business school. But then in the undergrads, there's another course that's kind of along these same lines. Point being that, these people between 18 and 22 who have been thrust into college environments, who are kind of the, in some of the most elite environments as far as like intellectual and academic complexity, right?
Right.
Are simply trying to understand, like, what does it mean to live a good life? How do I do it? What are some of the resources I can draw upon? Is there some kind of progression that I might follow? Are there people who have lived longer than me who might be able to help point the way? Is
a process of some sort, something I could grab onto?
That's right. That's right.
A demonstration.
Yeah. So I certainly have a lot to say to, the kind of institution of higher education and just where I think it's failing us. Because I think so many of us, like the Urantia book said, what it says about so many apparently indifferent youths, right, who would just like come rushing forward to live out the master's teachings if it were presented to them in a way that actually made sense to their life experience.
Well, let me ask you something right there, because that's something that, your dad, Chuck, and I have been talking a lot about, and just kind of like the ethos of Jesus's religion and what that might look like. And, we're so saturated in our current environment of this type of profit making and not so much of the gifting doing or the serving first and getting blown away with generosity type of thing. So I can't help but see how that always works its way into someone's life plan,
right.
Is it safe for me to live off of a gifting economy mindset? Is this communism? Can I have private property and love God? Like all of those questions. It's like even the notion of, can I like Jesus and not be a Republican or something like that? Like there's so much room for equivocation in our society that I admire the fact that you're going out there bringing revelation teachings that almost gives you independent wings to have spiritual vernacular, wisdom from spiritual development that you can apply in each of these situations.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to kind of riff on kind of your experience with that progression of people finding a process and someone like you there's having like a huge revelation for them to fit into their process, but still being respectful of whatever that growth process is along the way. Like how much do you give and how much do you not give?
Right. Oh yeah. I mean, I certainly agree that the presence of secular materialism in our dominant culture and the orientation toward the accrual of wealth, and also, kind of the accrual of status, the accrual of power of a certain kind, they all go together.
Right.
But certainly money is a really big one. In that is definitely, part of, I think, what you're pointing to about people feeling like they don't have permission to actually follow what really matters to them, or what is kind of what I would say is, coming from their soul, right?
Right.
Because
Totally.
it would be impractical. It would not allow for like a sort of stability financially, or they don't see how it would, or right. The putting the dollar bill at the center means
Right.
that everything we do has to lead toward the dollar bill and feel like it subscribes to the logic.
Do you also feel that maybe not just putting the dollar bill at center, but putting, animal security or physical security at the center?
Yeah.
And in this society, doing that is the dollar bill will do that for you.
That's
essentially.
right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Right. And it's, of course we do depend on some amount of security. Right. And there are many people who have felt insecure in basic human ways throughout their entire lives. And so, in no way am I disparaging the desire for people who felt
no, not at all
stable on these basic grounds, going in pursuit of that stability. I think it's absolutely necessary. And, it's the failing of our current system that we don't actually provide for people to have stability and have their basic human needs met. But I guess what I'm referring to is more the worship of money, the kind of displacement of what should be in the God seat,
right.
With that material gain.
Well, I want to ask you, so, as we were talking about, sometimes maybe there's the worship of money or worship of materialism. It comes into this, maybe this self-centered narcissism or whatever. How are you finding in your work where that springs up?
Right.
In a way that it's limiting everyone from finding that release into truth of soul growth. And I'm not trying to be pessimistic here. I'm just trying to say that to me, it seems like there's a pattern of blockages or challenges that the individual religionist has to break through.
That's right.
And so maybe where are you finding where other youth are having to break through some of these things?
Right. Well, it's been really fascinating because, I'll quickly say that one of the primary activities that I've been doing in my professional life the last 7 years or so has been getting to know innovative communities across the United States, some of which identify as secular, like fitness communities or arts communities or justice movements or maker spaces or gaming communities, right? These kinds of things. And some of which identify as religious, but tend to look more like the secular ones than they look like a kind of a traditional expression of their religious denomination. So whether that's like pop-up Shabbat, which is, people getting together around tables Friday nights, or whether it's, Muslim small groups or online Buddhist sanghas, or, people who turn laundromats into modern day foot washing by washing people's clothes. And then, it's these kinds of innovative expressions of religiosity. So for the last 7 years, I've gotten to know hundreds of these communities, and especially hundreds of leaders of these communities. And in one of the key performance indicators, one of the KPIs that we've started to use around the depth of the community that's being facilitated in these various environments is that people leave their jobs. And the reason they tend to leave their jobs is because they discover a sense of themselves and a sense of their own purpose that no longer fits in the frame. And they develop essentially an intolerance for the dissonance, the disconnect between who they are finding themselves to really be and what's being asked of them for like 40 plus hours a week. Right.
That's awesome.
Wow. They're unable to sustain it anymore and they have to leave. And so there's I guess I say that to point to the fact that, I imagine in our future, as our world evolves and as we move closer to what the Urantia Book calls light and life, a time of spiritual ripening, that that wouldn't be necessary, because the structures we would have created to support our vocations in the world would not be antagonistic to our souls, right?
Amen.
We wouldn't have to confront such wild dissonance between the place that we're employed and our heart's true desire, or, our sense of what our connection with God is calling us to do. And so I see this as a temporary state, but it could be the case for quite a while. And,
yeah.
and so part of what I'm trying to do, and honestly, it's challenging, is, I'm really trying to confront the workplace. And of course, that's a big generic term I'm using to talk about a wide variety of ways that people spend their working lives. But there are many work environments which are, essentially treating people transactionally. And that can be very devastating to the soul. And so part of what I'm doing now is really facing these work environments and asking, what could be done to help inculcate greater attention to spiritual values from leaders in these environments, and from the way that these environments are structured.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. So people are clear, you're basically now in the professional sector being a spiritual consultant for like secular businesses that have started to discern value in spirit, essentially. Am I right?
Well, that's part of it. That's part of
Sorry.
it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fill us in.
Yeah. Just in short, after graduating from Divinity School, I, with two other colleagues, I co-founded an organization called Sacred Design Lab. And really our whole premise is all about, in the face of all of this decline of religious institutions, how can we be about helping to inculcate greater soulfulness and attention to spirit wherever we can find it, right? So if we assume that there's going to need to be a lot of creativity right now and for many years to come in order to make way for new venues for spiritual life, then how do we pay attention to that and bring almost like a design approach to that question, right? How can we design for the soul on purpose? That's really what we're asking. And so we ask that in a variety of ways. We do plenty of projects that are not in workplaces and that are not through the lens of consulting. But we do have some projects that we do that are more directly facing organizations, whether they're nonprofit or for-profit, who have come to, for whatever reason, the conclusion that either a project they're doing is suffering for the lack of soulfulness in it, or that their whole organization is suffering for that reason. And so then we try to work with them as to what to do about that.
That's kind of trending. Oh, not kind of, it totally is, with your work and your studying about how we gather, why we gather, who's gathering, who's not gathering, where the hell is everybody, right?
Yeah, totally.
I feel like, to me, just like my little anthropological study that I do every day, I see that none of the youth are gathering unless it's something that's like really driving them, like working out or something like that. But still, that's this individual process. Yeah. And I wonder if, I know you used to be maybe more in-depthly organized with the organizations, the Urantia Book organizations. And one of the big trending topics was like, where's the youth? Where's the youth? We need youth. We failed because there's no youth. Right. And I know people really valued your studies. And so me studying your studies, seeing that, everybody's asking this question. It's not just we failed. It's not just the Catholic Church is having this problem and they failed. It's not just whatever reading room is failing. This is just what is, I feel like right now, and the product of what is. So I'd like to kind of maybe pick your brain of, what do you see kind of the teachings of Jesus or the reimagining of Jesus that does encourage and inspire youth to rush forward and be part of that?
Woohoo. Yeah. Well, first, just to affirm, I think that's absolutely the case that we have, we have crisis level isolation and spiritual longing across the board, and that it is not the failure of any one institution to attract the youth, so to speak. But that rather it feels like a sea change. It feels like we're in the midst of a significant transition, and where the spirit's on the move. And a lot of people are suffering in the midst of that, right? That's at least my call to action in my work and in my life, and what I understand as my ministry is this sense of, we have become atomized as a result of these fundamental sources of community falling away. Right. And in the midst of that, we have had the rise of the internet, of course, and our digital environments can absolutely be used for connection. But plenty of times they're not. And, that's all tied up in the kind of transactional economy we were just talking about a minute ago as well, right? Where we have been kind of encouraged to see each other transactionally. And so then we just take that all online where we already don't have to see each other. So it just it compounds and compounds. And, it really so often makes me long for what the Urantia Book talks about in terms of the need for our philosophy and our ethics and our spirituality to evolve at least as quickly, if not ahead of, our technology and our science, and, these things that are just rocketing ahead, right? So these are the troubled waters into which the Urantia Book has come. And
where you foresee Jesus is the reimagining of Jesus that can bring people forward, not just, being technically savvy,
right?
But what is it? What is it that they want? What's the demonstration that you think? Obviously, I mean, none of us are experts of anything.
Right.
What is it though? Do you have an opiniin as to what that looks like?
Yeah, I think first of all, there's never been a riper time in some ways. I'm putting a lot of my chips in on the kingdom of God is within you. So I'm doing a lot of work lately on just trying to do everything I can to help connect people to the living, loving spirit that dwells in their minds. That whole dimension of the gospel it just seems like it's such a timely message, because so many people are already turning to, this kind of nebulous landscape of mindfulness and meditation. And they've already kind of seen the lie of a single institution claiming to own truth. Right.
Right.
So they're already kind of taking it personal, but the personal religion as it's currently manifesting does not necessarily include a personal relationship with God.
Right.
And a lot of that has to do with portrayals of God and with the notion of God being external. So I'm really, I think that's one big one, is just the phenomenon of our being indwelt by a fragment of God, and the potential for each of us to have, to have a relationship. And when I think about all those students that I was talking about who are enrolling in these courses at these elite universities that are essentially about how to live a good life, and I think about what the Urantia Book says as to, how the great challenge to us, to modern people is this project of learning how to communicate with God, learning how to commune with this inner spirit. And, they call it, I think, the sane and well-balanced effort, right? To grow our inner lives, to grow our inner consciousness of spirit, and to increasingly live from that place of connectedness. And of course, that is only part of the story, right? That inner life is only part of the story. And if we stay in there, we atrophy. But luckily, the leading of our thought adjuster will not allow us to stay in there. And so then it has to do with the living of spiritual values in the world, the bearing of the fruits of the spirit in the world. And so I think that pairing of the reality of divinity within each of us, that each of us are children of God, and that's what that means. The pairing of that with then the notion, as Howard Thurman says, the spirit is not given to be kept, right? It's given to be shared. And so that fundamental nature of God that would choose to share God's self with each of us, that then becomes our invitation, and our orientation is like, how do I grow in not only connecting with God, but expressing God's spirit in the world. So I think that just basic organic reality and the adventure lure of that, right? The fact that like that's lifelong. I mean, it's actually eternity long, and that it calls so much out of us. It demands so much of us. So there's no shortage of adventure there. There's no shortage of energy that is required of each one of us in order to pull that off, right?
Well, I'm curious as to, maybe sidestepping a little bit here, is that for someone to step forward like you're doing, they need to have spiritual experience. Otherwise, there's nothing to teach from,
Right.
And so maybe we could take a step back and you could tell us, how did you find God? Because there's one thing of intellectually agreeing with a revelation, but there's another thing of knowing God and having that spiritual relationship. So maybe you could tell us a little bit how you found that?
Yeah, I would love to. Thanks for asking.
Right. Cool.
Well, so on some level, I think I've known God for a really long time. When I look back at my journals from when I was like 8 and 9 years old, I would say dear journal, but I was talking to God, and I would pray to God all over these journals. It'd be like, please God, I want to pray for this and this and this. So I had a good foundation of a kind of childhood connection. But when it really got serious, was actually not until I had already applied for divinity school. So this is only 7 years ago, or a little more than 7 years ago.
Okay.
And I was having pretty consistent, pernicious health problem that I'd gone to a number of different doctors for, and they kept giving me more, prescriptions for it, and the prescriptions were piling up and they were not helping. In fact, they seemed to be making it worse. And I was kind of at wit's end, and plus, some dimension of this health issue seemed to be connected to like my stress levels. The doctors kept saying like, take these drugs and also just try to relax. And and so, And so I just remember talking to my mom about it at one point, and she said something along the lines of, this could be a God thing, Angie. This could be something that you really need to work on with God. And so I had this very symbolic moment, because I was living in a little Brooklyn studio at the time, and I had a stack of prescriptions piled on top of my microwave. And because it was a tiny Brooklyn studio, my microwave and my kitchen were like next to my bed, because it was
yeah, of course.
So I remember sitting on my bed and looking at that stack of prescriptions on top of my microwave. And instead of going in to get the prescription, I set a microwave timer for 5 minutes. And I said, okay, for the next 5 minutes, I'm just going to try to commune with God. And one thing that's just important to say in this is, despite the whole foundation that was laid by my parents and growing up with other Urantia Book readers and all of this, what we spoke about at the very beginning of shelving the Urantia Book in college, my whole college experience and the 6 years after that of my life in New York were just so completely steeped in secular culture. Like it was so, I didn't have any friends, any peers outside of the Urantia community that I could talk to, or would kind of dare talk to about God, or things that were overtly spiritual. I mean, I was just so completely inside a secular container for my life. And so for me to even do this, to even spend 5 minutes with my microwave timer, I felt like I had to overcome all of these voices that were in my head already that said that it was crazy. that to do this was, was foolish, and that, smart people wouldn't do something this naive. And, I really had to latch on, and this is after the foundation I had, right? So it really says something about what somebody who didn't have that foundation might be experiencing.
Absolutely.
But I just remember like really relying on not just the example of Jesus, but the knowledge. Like I had a vague knowledge that millions of people had done something like this throughout history. The sense of like, I'm not alone. There are other people who have tried to connect to God and they have found it fruitful.
Cool.
So I'm going to take, a leap of faith. It was definitely a leap of faith to do that and to try. And, honestly, that first 5 minutes was basically just like firing synapses, and I was like, how does anyone get any clarity in here? It was not particularly revelatory, but what I did was I just made a commitment to keep trying.
Okay.
And from that day on, I started spending, first it was 5 minutes a day, and then it would be 10 minutes a day, and then it was 20. And then, I basically spent that whole summer before divinity school writing this musical about Jesus. So I had this kind of co-creative relationship to God that started to form. And just, since that time, there's been a growing connection. And I remember, in the fall of that same year, so it had been maybe 5 months or so since that first concerted effort with the microwave timer, I just remember this experience where I was literally just walking down the street. I was already then in Cambridge in grad school. I was at Harvard, and I was just I was overcome by a feeling. It was a feeling of peace and joy and just, I guess, a fullness of being that I had never experienced before in my life. And the only way I can really think to talk about it intellectually is just to say that at that time, it was as if I no longer feared death. And it was like the floor of fear came up. Like there used to be that kind of like long, there were so many fears.
Drop off.
Yeah. And it was suddenly like the existential fear, like it was gone. And here was the floor. It was like,
it was an intellectual mind fraud.
Yes. The intellectual
unreasoned fear
had been, I guess,
exposed,
in some way, given its place. I mean, it's not to say I'm not afraid of things. I'm surely afraid of plenty of things still, but the existential level changed. And I mean, I was so high. I was just on cloud 9 for like 3 days. And I was like, is this what my life is just going to be like now?
Like, I'm stuck on this.
It was like, yeah, religion is really on to something, and there have been plenty of experiences since then, but that's kind of a state experience that will always stick with me of, that it hasn't gone back, right? That since that time, it's just continued to go forward in terms of, I mean, all I want to do is get to know God better. It's the best.
Cool. I thanks for sharing that. 'Cause like, I've been kind of like all gleeful lately. I feel like I've been really trying to make communication with my soul.
Nice.
And just like as much as I can, like every moment as much as I can, and whatever those internal visualizations of me connecting with my soul up there and kind of transferring identity and decision making and all that stuff, and just getting to know. And so I kind of came up with this idea that it's really like the soul is like the offspring of us and God, right? With the indwelling adjuster. And here we have this like spiritual umbilical cord that we can kind of transfer with our soul and feed each other. And just that awareness, and it's something that a study that your dad and I are working on about laying up your treasures in heaven, and what that really means of kind of like what you're talking about. It's like feeding the soul and working with the soul as your real treasure throughout eternity, and at least into the next stage. So with that then came like this huge gleeful feeling like for like 3 or 4 days, and it wouldn't stop. And I'm like, kept doing like an internal check. Like, wait, do I still feel good today? Yes, I do. All right. Let's keep going,
Yes. Oh my gosh. I'm so glad that we can share that. Gleeful is definitely a good word.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it might be good cheer, Derek.
Oh yeah, totally good cheer. It is good cheer. And it's like you said, and the reason why I thought of this is because when you talked about how like your like intellectual mind frauds of existential fear, just kind of like the drop off filled in and the floor came right to your feet again. I felt the same way. I think, everyone comes from whatever challenges they come from. And I always came from a challenge of like more abandonment or having like a void that needed to be filled. And, the teachings of Jesus is absolutely filled that. But I think this identity with the eternal, like choosing to blend your identity with divinity, and then getting to know what that feels like and just totally sincerely just accepting and getting to know and choosing to grow in that is really been, from my personal experience, what has filled that void or filled the floor that was sunken like you had, into a point where it's not like you step into nothingness anymore. The floor is solid. And It reminds me of how Jesus in the spirit of truth is like, I will build this church on such a foundation of rock, not in sand, not in material that we might look at it, but in such a solid foundation of love that I think you and I both experienced the accurate portrayal of reality finally, as opposed to some unreasoned perspective version of reality that a lot of us struggle with.
Oh yeah. Well, and it's, I think you're right on that. A big part of that shift in mindset has to do with a shift in a sense of identity, right? You were just describing how you're identifying with your soul.
Yeah, totally.
And
totally.
There's such an assurance in that. There's, an assurance of eternity, and that as a foundation, it just puts everything else in perspective, and I think one of my things, you were talking about abandonment. I think one of my things is just a sense of like, I have to earn my value. That I get into a sense of internal pressure that I have to generate, I have to create, I have to prove that I'm worthy. Even though I know that I am beloved as a child of God as I am, I sometimes slip into forgetting about that, feeling like I have to prove it. Right. And so for me, one of the gifts of it is just it relieves the pressure, because it's like, obviously each of us in our own way are trying to do our part to, and contribute to the supreme and grow our souls and all of this. But it's this deep sense, you talk about a foundation on rock. It's like, Michael has got this, like they've got it, Mother Spirit and all the celestials. And like, we're just so supported and so loved and so cared for. And, each of us is invited to contribute, but we're not invited to contribute in such a way that if we fall short, the whole game falls apart. We're here because we're learning and growing.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because part of my experience of this deeper connection with my soul has been the deep feeling of my soul is so loved and cared after, like just so loved and protected, that you really do understand that this is a bastion that no one can penetrate.
Right.
Your soul and that love in spirit can never be taken. It is eternal. And to have that realization, there's no more anxiety in that anymore. It's just like, and like the true religionist knows, and they know now, and it's like, you can't always explain it, but you can feel it. And I like to kind of that whole, because I'm not a parent, but I'm trying to work out the experience of being like a parent to my soul, but also being a child to my soul. Like, because there's so much more that I can learn, yet there's also so much that what I'm creating now is contributing to that soul.
Yeah.
So it's like I'm pregnant with my soul, kind of, even though I can like connect with it and talk to him and stuff. It's pretty crazy.
I know. Well, and, just the knowledge that eventually we're going to fuse with our thought adjusters, right? And at that point, the part of us that is divine is going to be our identity. We are going to be that, right? And so there is, that's this other aspect of it, at least for me, is this sense of like, when you say I'm pregnant with my own soul, like I'm the parent and the child, it's like, well, eventually you will be, because you will be one. And
that's good. That's cool.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks for saying that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we will be, and I think that's part of Jesus's invitation to us to fatherly love, to love as he loved and loves, is just that is essentially to practice identifying with the father fragment within us, is to practice allowing that to be our identity. And
I love that. And it also made me think that maybe like, how maybe we can get caught up on like sexes and genders and stuff. I feel like as a human, dude, our gender is creator. Like that's what we do. So think about nothing but we're all creating a soul, right? Women, they get to like double birth process because they birth their soul and they birth children, right? The added responsibility, right? That's like a blessing and a responsibility. Right. We all have our thing.
Yeah, be fathers, which is a whole other thing.
but nonetheless, is that we get to experience this creativity that is this birthing process, both for ourselves and for our future selves. So the pre, the present, and the future, origin, history, destiny, whatever is all happening now. It's awesome.
It's on. It's all happening now. Yeah. So awesome. No, I totally agree. And you're right. I mean, and just like you're saying that you're kind of like the parent and child, we are both, we're creatures, right? We're definitely mortals who have a whole bunch of animal origin going on. And we are indwelt by the creator, and we are en route to being creators. That's, and of course we express creativity throughout our lives, and we're encouraged to do so a lot.
Yeah. And I wanted to comment on another thing that you were talking about. The idea of this is like a testing ground kind of experiment thing,
Practice.
And a practice. And I there's a part in the Urantia book, and I'll probably mess it up, but I know it's in there, where it says it's not so much, what you did in that first life, but just having experienced a life, a material life, is what's really important. Just having that experience of living that life and dying and then moving on or whatever. So I think about it out here as like, it's really important to me what I do on this planet, but also it's a little bit of like a virtual reality safety net for your soul, so that you can like start to develop your soul, but you don't crush it hard down here too much. You know what I mean? You don't destroy it, but yet it's such valuable training. Even though it can be crude to us, it's such valuable training. It feels like the way the angels look at it, it's almost like, a kid in the ball pool or something, where in the shallow end and they have floaties on, and you're like, don't worry, kid, like you're going to be out of those floaties in no time anyway, swimming in the deep end. So I'm not taking too much stock in this situation right now.
Even though they're thrashing around and it feels like a big deal, right?
Totally.
Yeah. It's a good point. You're just making me wonder. I've thought about this, but, for both of us, Derek, you and I, having had the Urantia book teachings in some way in our life for so long, I do wonder about this. Like, I find myself so consistently thinking about the afterlife, or like putting my life in relationship to the future, not the future on this world, but the future after that. And I just kind of wonder if that's in part a byproduct of being a second generation Urantia Book reader, kind of taking for granted that the frame of my understanding about life is not limited to this world.
Well, I'd say yes, it can be. From my own experience, even though I'm a second generation Urantia Book reader, I did not grow up with it.
Yeah.
So it is something that I found later, like 27 years old.
Got it.
I started reading. And I think it's literally like the more you progress spiritually in your sincerity, the more capacity is created. And then the more visualizations and intense picturizations can be presented to one's mind that then can start to grok like greater structures and greater principles of Urantia life, or what our lessons now are leading to in the future and things like that. So I would just say, you're doing it. That's what you're doing, is what it sounds like to me.
Got it. Yeah. I was thinking about, like, for instance, that notion that the last shall be first, which is,
I love that.
But one of, when you think about it through almost in technical terms, based on at least the teachings in the Urantia Book, the idea that we go to the mansion worlds and we progress, and we're essentially, after we die, we're going through training for soul training, basically, and that we start our soul training wherever we left off here. And, I think about people who have experienced a great deal of tribulation here on earth, and who have, in the midst of that tribulation, found faith and found a way through that has allowed them to overcome their circumstances, and to, that whole experience that one might have would be so contributory to the soul. And that then, upon arriving at Mansonia in the afterlife, you
What's
would literally,
up?
you'd be ahead of the game,
Yeah, it's like all those AP credits you took down there. All right, paid off.
Exactly. Yeah, you don't have to retake that course.
The whole survival, reaching out to God in desperation. I passed that one.
I passed that one again and again, right? Like I know that one. I could, So anyway, I think it's really fun to put the teachings of Jesus, especially, which were over 2000 years ago, in the context of, this kind of upstepped portrayal of truth. And as you ask about, what do we need now? We need new portrayals of those teachings that are consistent with the science that we have now, and with the evolution of our civilization in the last couple thousand years, and all of that, that'll just help to spark the imagination, and help to inspire people to spend their time in a way that's really worthwhile, and that's, going to help them feel that sense of cheer that you and I have both discovered in this way, right? It's such a counterpoint to so much of what I experience and work with the people I try to serve is, there's so much anxiety, so much depression, so much despair, so much anger. There's just such a whole cauldron of bad feeling, and of a sense of being valueless, and of this life not being worthwhile. So, there's a real call to action in all that.
Amen. And I'm glad you're out there doing it, acting, being the demonstration. Really appreciate it, Angie. Okay. I think I'm going to let you go, because I know you're super busy, and we're very privileged and blessed to have you join us on this holiday. Thank you so much, Angie.
Thank you for having me. It's a real treat. I love getting to talk to you about this stuff, Derek.
All right. Well, we'll do it again. I know we will.
Sounds good. All
right. And thank you guys for joining us again. Angie's super dynamic. We're really lucky to have her. Thank you guys. Thank you, Angie. And we'll see you next time.